Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and today I'm excited to welcome Jason Howk, a U.S. Army veteran whose service spanned major developments of our Afghan adventure, from supporting the early developments of the Afghan National Army in 2002 to overseeing interagency teams of civilians working to establish enduring security in the region in 2013. Jason is now the president of Global Friends of Afghanistan, which is a diverse organization of Afghan and international leaders searching for paths to a democratic future and a peaceful future for Afghanistan in the aftermath of Taliban rule. Jason's also a writer, a musical collaborator, and an adjunct professor of Islamic studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School. It's really good to have you here, Jason. Thanks for joining me and talking about all that you're doing through GFA and through your passion for Afghanistan.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you. Let's start with your interest in Afghanistan, because you clearly just have this, like I said, passion for the country. When did that start for you?
I knew of Afghanistan in high school from following what was happening with the Soviets, but didn't really know much about the country until September 11th. Really started to look at what's going on. I was in the 82nd Airborne Division at the time. We were rapidly called upon to start sending forces over there. So that kind of started my journey. I had a Muslim chaplain at my battalion at the time, so that was kind of helpful to get some insights into Islam and Muslim cultures. But I deployed in 2002 within the first year of our time on the ground in Afghanistan. And that was kind of my real introduction to the country. And in that job, I ended up working as Carl Eikenberry's aide-de-camp. He was the two-star general sent there to work with the international community to build the entire security sector and really help build the Afghan government. So we worked out of the embassy. And then he was also in charge of building specifically the Army, to build the first corps of the Army in that year. So when the 82nd went home, I stayed. My 4-month tour became a 12-month tour. And I stayed with him, and we worked with all of the Afghan leadership in just about every ministry and presidents, vice presidents. And it was an amazing introduction to a country to see it start to build itself up and rebuild its human capital. So that it made a lot of impact on me, and I traveled to nearly every province and got to meet lots of different Afghans, and they provided our security on that tour. We didn't have a battalion of soldiers with us. It was a 2-star general, his lieutenant aide, a few bodyguards, and Afghans all over the country were moving us around in their vehicles, their helicopters, their airplanes, and protecting us. So we learned pretty quickly to gain a lot of trust in our new partners.
That's really amazing. And I'm just imagining, I don't want to skip ahead to GFA, but you witnessed this coalescing of all these groups to create this government back in 2002. And I imagine that those kind of things might still be very firmly in your head as you're looking to what you guys are doing through Global Friends of Afghanistan and trying to keep up that apparatus so that it's ready when the time comes, maybe to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
that was a big lesson for us, is working with General Eikenberry, who had a lot of experience working with foreign governments as a FAO and a international relations expert. I got to see what's needed as a new country builds itself and what was missing after 35 years of war. So that's weighed on my mind the entire 20 years I've been working on Afghanistan, and definitely when we built Global Friends of Afghanistan. How do you keep that strong and fresh? How do you ensure that there are Afghans who are capable to run a democracy and a republic?
Yeah, I'd love to ask you about the Afghan National Army specifically, because we've had a lot of people talking here about the end state of the Afghan National Army and, the corruption that still kind of existed in places, or war crimes and things of that nature. And then the inability to continue operating without that contractor corps. But at the beginning, what were the struggles that you were seeing as that whole force was just coalescing?
Yeah, the beginning was, I think, a signal of what was to come if we didn't do this long term. When we got there, I always tell people the country wasn't at the 0 point. It was at -50. It was a society completely in survival mode. Healthcare broken, education broken, economy collapsed. infrastructure, everything. And so everybody had very selfish motivations when we arrived. In that first year, you could just see everybody trying to figure out. They had no idea how long we were going to be there. They'd been abandoned by America before. They'd been mistreated by many nations before. So there was a lot of trust to overcome and to build. Mistrust was high. I think that was the struggle. We saw people who couldn't read or write and had health problems we had never even thought about, trying to form an army. And that was a challenge. They were strong physically and strong mentally, but also, weak mentally because they had been so beaten and traumatized for 35 years. And the stories that I would hear from Afghans that lived through the Civil War, through the Taliban occupation, it made you realize very quickly how traumatized that country was. And you have to dodge mortar rounds on the way to your elementary school, and watch people get tortured and see tortured and dead bodies on the ground in the mornings as a kid. That's hard. So that was going to be a problem all the way through. How do you really get an organization to build as tight as a military needs to build and grow? And so it wasn't like this was a 10-year project. It was a 100-year project. If you think about the American Army at 19 years old, it was horrible. And so we left with a 19-year-old army in place that started at worse place than the Americans did. And I think that was just our short-sightedness all the way along.
I feel like I'm gonna end up juxtaposing all of the past and present throughout this entire thing anyway. So let's pull forward now. We're 2 years and some change out from when we left. And the Taliban have been able to try to drag the country back into the past, in terms of we haven't seen maternal mortality figures to my knowledge, or maybe we have, but it's, we know women are not getting maternal health care the way that they should because the Taliban don't value that. We know that literacy for females is now just plummeting. Security is, some say, better because you don't have, war in the way that it was going on before, but you still have those, beheadings or bodies being found in the street dead. So would you say that, it's pretty clear that we're going backwards towards that point that you encountered in 2002, but have we gotten to that point? How would you juxtapose those two scenarios now from 2002 to today?
I think in many areas we're already back to the 1990s. One being insecurity. When Afghans are living under the threat of death every day, it doesn't mean it's peaceful just because the terrorists have stopped their, full on and, fight against an army. That is considered war. But Afghans still feel like they're living in a war because they don't know any day they're going to stop at a checkpoint and just get shot. And that's living under a life of terror. It can probably be more traumatic than, having, at least there were soldiers around before. Now all Afghans are on their own. Every so-called soldier and policeman is a terrorist. So life is short and brutal again. And I think that's going to really hurt the resilience of the Afghan people for a long time. That just brings them back to every nightmare they remember from the 1970s through the 1990s.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you call them terrorists.
Yes,
because that's what they are. They're not allowing for any. Yeah, it's important to call a spade, and there are too many people in the international community who are still trying to.
Yeah, they're trying to make the best of a horrible thing so they don't look so bad. But yeah, I'm with you. The maternal problems, all the women's, it's a gender apartheid system now, so all the women's issues are back. All the health issues will compound. The education systems are already collapsed. They've converted it into, some kind of brainwashing center to radicalize young Afghans. So luckily women aren't in that. The young girls are, being spared that and taught at home at least. But that's a lot of young boys you're going to have to deal with in the future who are going to be going down the wrong path. And you got to reverse that. So I'm sure parents are crushed that that's the only option now for their kids.
Yep, but they don't have any recourse either. And that's the scary thing, is that this group of, I think I heard someone say there were about 80,000 Talibs who took over the country. And this group is holding the whole country hostage because we let that happen. And it's just very disgruntling. I want to talk to, so, 2002, obviously that was a very formative period, but, I mentioned explicitly that 2013 period, that interagency team that you were part of. And I wanted to hear more about what that was, what that was like, and how things had changed at that point, 11 years on.
Yeah. So briefly, before I get to that, how I ended up doing that, in 2009, I went back to Afghanistan as General McChrystal's aide-de-camp. And I'd gotten him through the Senate process and through all the out briefs and the prep at the Joint Staff and the Pentagon. And then we flew over to Afghanistan, and we did this survey of the country, kind of flew around the whole place. I introduced him to all the leaders that I had met in 2002 because he had been working special ops. He wasn't in the Capitol dealing with the politicians. So I kind of worked on that effort. And then once the evaluation was done of what we thought needed to happen to the strategy, I shifted over to build the reintegration and reconciliation process for ISAF, for NATO, and for America. So we started working with Ambassador Holbrook's team. We were the guys in Kabul actually making all of the magic happen that he was in DC taking credit for. So I worked on that, and that put me in touch with a lot of interesting future scenarios. One of those being, hey, when you come back to America, we want you to watch this process you stood up. So I ended up, leading a team of analysts, a couple teams of analysts that were watching that process. This was during some of this so-called secret talks that broke out into the New York Times about those early discussions between America and the Taliban, just to see what could happen and what might happen. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, a lot of that had veered from what we started in 2009, and we were not focusing on how to get the Afghans in the room with the Taliban. We spent too much time getting Americans in the room with the Taliban, and that only hurt the Afghan government, and it hurt our future chances of success with the country. So that was my last real job in the Army, was watching that process. It really didn't go anywhere at the point I retired in 2015.
Wow. And I can't imagine how that would have felt from your angle. It was hard. That was about the time that I left the intelligence community. It was in 2013 as that peace process or those negotiations were underway. And I was so demoralized to see the way, because I only saw it from the media after I left, and it was really hard for me. And I imagine being part of it and hoping that it would go one way and then watching it, shift. Did you already sense that it was just not going to be what leadership wanted, or do you think they were looking for an easier way out than maybe some kind of military solution? Or
yeah, when we started looking at that in 2009, it's because the Afghans wanted to look at a possible peace process with the Taliban, and which, with the surge of forces coming into the country, it made sense. So we started working from the reintegration angle. I briefed the international community on what we were going to do. As a captain, I was kind of the first person building that organization and setting it up. And so we explained that the purpose was really to weaken the Taliban, to get them to quit, to have their fighters quit, and to eventually get senior Taliban leaders to diplomatically speak with the Afghan government and negotiate their way out. So it had the focus of it was to strengthen Afghanistan's government and weaken the Taliban. And it drifted from that back and forth over the years. I kept some hope alive that we could do it right, but in the end, I think Obama wanted to get out more than he cared about how we got out. Trump wanted to get out more than he cared about how. And Biden just didn't give a damn at all and wanted out the second he could do it, and just pretended to listen to everybody for a little while and then made his decision at the last minute and pulled the plug. So all of those negotiations were kind of done in a half measure. And that was frustrating because we could have continued to help strengthen the Afghans through that process. And instead, we just weakened them at the end.
Yeah, by not involving them and not letting, that just so demoralizing. We've propped up this government, and the Taliban the whole time said, well, this is a puppet government. Yep. And they were correct. We did not let them be involved. They, it was really demoralizing for everybody, I think, to see how that happened. But then, let's go forward to where you were at the time of the withdrawal. So you had left the Army, you'd left that whole process behind. Like, what was what was your involvement like again when you got re-involved?
When I retired in 2015, I spent a couple of years just working on interfaith work and traveling the country talking about Islam to Americans and helping them understand it. Then I got pulled into the Trump transition to help them set up the National Security Council with General Flynn. He asked me to join them and help set that up. So I got pulled back to D.C., had some inputs on the counterterrorism strategy and national security strategy and what we might do with Afghanistan again. And then I was asked by some folks that were working for the State Department what a outreach might look like under the Trump administration. So I told them what we shouldn't do based on my lessons from Obama, and they did just that and worse. So although I was having inputs, no one was listening to what actually might make sense based on the history of Afghanistan. So it's frustrating to watch a lot of people that didn't know the history of Afghanistan making really important decisions and not listening to anybody who actually knew what they were talking about. So a couple times, 2018, 2019, 2020, I would help CENTCOM with different things they were working on. By 2019, I was getting asked by the Afghan government and the senior diplomat from NATO in Kabul to help them think about, different topics in their National Security Council. So I was advising, not just for free. I'm not an agent of any other country. So, as an academic, I helped, the NATO team and the Afghan government in any way I could to bridge gaps and find some common ground and sent my advice over to those folks. I knew General Miller pretty well from earlier times in my career. And so I was just trying to help the team. But when the collapse came, I was actually working for USIP on a contract to look at some track 2 diplomacy and look past the end of Afghanistan when the word came down that we were leaving with everything. And we actually had a meeting scheduled with folks in Kabul on August 15th. So I had to WhatsApp everybody and say, hey, get safe and get out, because this is it. It's over with. So that instantly turned into, I was pulled into the evacuation because thousands of Afghans knew me and started asking me for help. And so I was teaming up with all the other, veterans and State Department and groups out there and intelligence community groups that were trying to evacuate people and find donors and find airplanes and helicopters. And so worked that for the last part of August until the collapse came. So that was a really tough moment to, just get WhatsApp and emails and texts and Twitter messages from people that I knew for years, that I'd known for decades, helped me get out. And, a lot of us were pretty powerless. I had my USIP contract, had a State Department guy on it, and he happened to sit on the Afghanistan desk. So I had some ins to the State Department to be like, hey, here's some stuff. We need help with this. But, State Department was working like crazy. I know they were bringing their spouses in to work with them to try to speed up the process. I mean, it was just chaos over there. Nobody in our government was prepared for it. So that was a frustrating moment, and that led to us forming the Global Friends of Afghanistan. As we saw the collapse ending, we said, what comes next?
That's really interesting. So as most people were, and I mean, you were involved in that too, the sleepless nights of Signal and WhatsApp messages, you were also moving on to, okay, because you're probably seeing all of these former government personnel leaving the country, no longer being able to be there. And, maybe did you form GFA because there was the hope that maybe the Taliban wouldn't be able to retain control? Or was it just, let's have something where we can continue having these conversations? What was the thought?
On the morning of I don't know if it was August 31st or it was the 15th, but I got a text from CNN, will you come on TV in the morning and talk about this? So I went on Jim Sciutto's show and I talked about how it had happened and how we got there. And I got the sense from CNN that this was probably the last time that our media was going to care about Afghanistan. And I talked to a lot of my friends who had also just been doing the rounds with media explaining what just happened. And they all said the same thing. It feels like the Biden administration wants nothing to do with this. And the media is going to be happy to go along with that. And they're not going to cover it either. And so we said, well, if we just let Afghanistan fall into obscurity again, it's the 1990s all over again, and no one's going to watch it or care about it. So I said, how do we get how can we help the security folks inside of our government to keep Afghanistan in the conversation so that we're still watching it and the humanitarian efforts can continue and we could try, future diplomacy and how do we, the Afghans are in shock. They just lost their country. So what can we do as folks who care about it? So about 10 or 11 of us from around the world just set up Global Friends of Afghanistan, and I was nominated to be the director by everybody. So I said, okay, I'll be the director. And we started running, and then we pulled in as many Afghans as we could as they got through the shock of losing their countries so that it would have, be majority Afghan, and their perspectives would be the ones we were talking about, not just a bunch of Western dudes and Western ladies talking about what we think, but we would sit and listen with Afghans, and really listen to Afghans about what the future should hold and share our ideas. But, how can we help amplify their voices? That was the real goal.
And it's so important. And I think that's a lesson learned too of having watched how we went in and kind of did I hate to use Taliban language, the puppeteering, but, put in our own checks and balances to try to create some kind of equality, which I think we did that. I'm thinking about like the different ethnic makeups of, the government needing to have representation, which I think is a great idea in theory, but the way that we did that then ended up creating, we over manipulated something in many cases that then didn't become an Afghan-led enterprise or didn't have that air of authenticity, or at least the Taliban could exploit that. And I love this. Like, I love seeing GFA is really, there are so many amazing Afghan voices getting heard through that. And that is the key thing, whatever comes next, it has to be the voices of Afghans so that the whole country can rally behind that, because I've seen the Taliban propaganda machine at work talking already against anybody who could possibly stand against the Taliban. And there's going to be a big, hard hurdle for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
mean, that was my biggest lesson from getting there in 2002 was, and I think it is overstated a lot of times how much America had sway and how the Afghans were going to organize things. Actually, a lot of European nations had a lot of sway in what was going to happen. But Afghans were really, I thought, pretty strong about how they needed to work for Afghanistan. So even though they might tell us in a meeting, okay, we'll look at that, they didn't listen and do the stupid things we told them. They did what was going to make sense for Afghanistan. So I'll give them credit for that. A lot of that was the Taliban propaganda machine and the ISI propaganda machine in Pakistan saying, look, puppet government, look, they only listen to them. When in reality, they weren't listening as much as only when they had to. If they couldn't get away from listening, then they wouldn't. But I remember a moment when I was General McChrystal's aide, and we had to go meet him at the Oregon and meet him for the first time. And I had told him we need to bring our dress uniform, our Class A uniforms when we meet the president. And everybody thought I was crazy, and I was like, "He's the president. Would you wear it? You wore it to see Obama, so you should wear it to see Karzai." So they agreed. We brought them, and I rode over with them, and we walked in, and there's all these ambassadors, and the CIA station chief is there, and we walked in dress uniforms, and they all just stared at us. Now, Eikenberry was the ambassador. He looked at me and winked. He was like, "Good call. That's how you want to meet the president when you're the commander." And when McChrystal sat down with Karzai, he said, "I've never had anybody wear a dress uniform to speak to me that was the commander of ISA, of NATO, or the other forces. Like, this is interesting." Like, that changed the dynamic of building. Like, McChrystal telling him, "It's your country. I'm respecting you as a president." And when he came to him later and said, "I want your permission to, here's the plan we think should work. What do you think? How do you want to run your war, Commander in Chief?" Again, Karzai was like, "Nobody's ever asked me." So we had started to involve the Afghans and really give them ownership. But the Taliban, again, they're just great at propaganda. They played it up all the way through.
They definitely are. They're exceptional at lying, which is what, propaganda really is when you get down to brass tacks. I wanted to ask you this earlier, but I thought, I won't get into the nitty gritty here. But McChrystal was so different from other leaders of that effort. And that was one of the questions I was asked during my, when I was interviewed for my position, is what I thought about McChrystal. And I think they probably thought that, some 22-year-old young girl is not going to have an answer to that. But I remember thinking he was so unique. He came from such a different background, and he went at his job, I think, with a different kind of zeal and fervor, maybe. And it sounds like a unique, that respect, that is a unique thing. Clearly, what was your take on McChrystal's time before the Rolling Stone article?
I had known McChrystal since I was a private. He was my battalion commander when he was at the 82nd Airborne Division. And I was a company RTO at one point, so I used to talk to him on the radio all the time. So I literally knew him very well.
Mm-hmm.
We stayed in touch over the years. And so when I was asked to go as a captain as his aide-de-camp, people were shaking their heads, but he was like, I know Jason, and he knows Afghanistan, so he's coming. He had a very different approach. He's a learner, a constant learner. He wanted to listen. He wanted to find out the truth. He wanted to, get away from misperceptions. I was with him every day as we were going through the Senate and the representatives' offices and finding out what they thought and sitting down with different people, leaders in DC. He's just a very good observer of bullshit and reality. And so that was a useful thing. And he works hard. Before we left the PAC, the Joint Staff area at the Pentagon to get on the plane, he pulled all the folks behind that were not deploying in the first wave. He had brought in a lot of people he knew from around the world to deploy over time. And he sat down with everybody and said, look, I've told President Obama I'll do 3 years if that's what it takes to win the war. And you could have heard a pin drop in the room when he said that, because everybody was like, three years in Afghanistan? And so I told him afterwards, I said, I'll do 3 years if you do 3 years. This is important. We've got to do this. Of course, the Army pulled the plug on that when they were, you can't do 3 years, Captain. You're coming home. You've been there a year. And his plug got pulled later, unfortunately, through people with loose lips. But yeah, he had a different approach. He's a learner. He's a thinker. He understood the importance of listening to Afghans and really thinking about what they wanted for their country and not what he wanted or what America wanted or what NATO wanted. He wanted to get to what they needed. And he listened to Afghans from across the spectrum. We would sit down with college kids. We would, talk to farmers. We would meet with local villagers out in the middle of nowhere, sit down with all of the different leaders, different warlords that were still in power and had some sway. He listened, and that's an important piece of any puzzle, I think.
Oh yeah, you have to understand, and it's a complex problem set. And you mentioned really briefly earlier all the NATO countries, with their like the provincial reconstruction team, where you've got like these PRTs from 100 different countries, not 100, but it felt that way, and you've got all these different cooks in this very complicated kitchen. And it was always mind-boggling to think like how you're adding so many levels of complexity to something that's already so complex. And yeah, I loved McChrystal's approach. Just seemed like a turnaround that Afghanistan so desperately needed at that time, right before the surge and then during
it raised
the surge. And it was,
I didn't mean to cut you off, but it raised the morale of the Afghan government and people to see somebody come in and listen to them and show them respect. Because I had known a lot of these guys. I grew up with Amrullah Saleh. We were the same age when I went there the first time. And so, he was back again as running senior leader in their security sector. They were excited. They're like, oh my gosh, you actually sent us a general who cares, who listens, and who is going to do a lot of the things that we have been telling you guys to do for almost a decade now. This is good. Mm-hmm. And so his departure was quite a morale buster in itself. The Afghans were pleading with President Obama not to do it,
Yeah. And I understand why, I get that. It was such, things were looking up, and I think as terrible as the surge was in terms of lives lost, those lives were lost to gain ground that needed to be gained. And then, from there, it's like you just saw this constant chipping away of everything. And it was so hard. I had to stop watching at one point, which is why, the withdrawal came. And for me, it was like, oh my gosh, now I'm getting, it's sucking me back in. But I want to let's go back to Global Friends of Afghanistan starts to form. You're creating this huge group because you've got this network of people that you know, and you have held a couple different conferences to try to, bring these big ideas forward and let Afghans, present ideas about the future, talk about the future. What was the first of those GFA conferences like?
So the first conference we did in partnership with Georgetown, and the aim of that one, everybody was still in shock. It was just a year after the collapse. So it was really tightly organized by really a couple of veterans and former diplomats. But we brought in lots of Afghans to speak on panels and invited a lot of Afghans to attend. But we knew they just were not in a place to try to run anything like this. So that was focused on figuring out what had happened during the collapse and the evacuation, talking about resettlement and integration, and then the security situation of the country. And then in one of the working groups, so we do our conferences a little different. We have a lot of working groups where we break away from the big hall and sit down in small groups and discuss problems and solutions and then present those back at the conference to the full audience. One of those was looking at the future of possible government in the country. And so that topic led us this year when we held our conference, which was mostly planned and led by an Afghan and American team because we wanted Afghans to drive what we were talking about, who we're inviting, how would this go? What do you want to get out of this? And it was great because the composition switched. We were going to talk about government and resettlement, and also about human rights issues and how anybody can help people stuck inside Afghanistan. So it was really focused on here are the problems now, what do we do about it, and the lots of working groups. And this time the composition switched, where the first year it was mostly veterans and people who took part in the evacuation and the DC Afghanistan Hands program, basically all the folks that worked on it, and then about 40% were Afghans. This year it was set up, run by Afghans. We were kind of just the guides for it. They were driving it, and we were keeping it moving along. And I think we had about probably 70% were Afghan. So this year was where we wanted it to go and where we wanted to go in the future, where we provide a space for Afghans to get together from all over the world. We had folks flying in from Asia and Europe to come to this, to give them a space to sit and talk amongst themselves safely, privately, and have some hard discussions. And it was really a good thing to see. And I think they walked away with a lot of new ideas. The Herat security dialogues coming up in Dushanbe, you're going to see a continuation of what we started picking up there. A lot of those conversations are going. So we've been working in the last year to get lots of different organizations, Tony Blair Institute, the AISS team, some folks out of Canada and the UK, to make sure that this is building on itself, that this is giving Afghans more and more opportunity to think about their future, and maybe set up some kind of government in exile and flip the script on the Taliban, do the same to them, pull some power away from the Taliban.
Do you have any indication that the Taliban is aware that this is still, that they still have competition outside of the country?
Absolutely. I am a regular target of cyber attacks from Pakistan ISI's team on behalf of the Taliban. So yeah, they come at me pretty hard. So if I make a comment, I'm going to get some weird follower from random made up account that just came online. So it's pretty much daily. So they watch me pretty closely, but I see them hitting other people in GFA and people I know that are working on this. So they see this as a threat. They don't want Afghans to be thinking about the future of their country. And they don't want Afghans to take any diplomatic weight away from the Taliban. Right now, they get the diplomats go see the Taliban or meet them in Qatar. So they don't want other Afghan groups to pull those diplomats in another direction. The Taliban's number one goal is still to get recognized as a government, and they will not waver from that goal. So everything that interferes with that goal is an enemy to them.
Sure. And we've seen, Tom West and others go meet with the Taliban now. And, that is something that seems to kind of be moving forward in their favor. What are your thoughts? I'm sure I know what your thoughts are on that, but I'd love to hear you expound on them about, what the U.S. should be doing, learning from its past, and all of that going forward.
GFA team's got a pretty good link into the State Department and DoD and into some other parts of the government. So we talk to people regularly. I think the State Department's doing a better job of pulling back from that stuff publicly. We're not traveling and to have photo ops and do propaganda meetings. They're also ensuring they meet with other parts of the Afghan civil society and different groups in diaspora, refugee groups. And Tom West even said himself, if there was a government in exile, I would meet with them. And I've heard that from other diplomats. So I think they've come to the same conclusion most of us have. There's no future talking to the Taliban and the Afghani terrorists. I mean, they are still in bed with Al-Qaeda. They want to talk to some opposition group. They don't want to see the Taliban recognized as a government. Now, there are plenty of businessmen who do. China wants them to. Pakistan wants them to. Russia doesn't care. Iran doesn't care. Turkey doesn't care. Qatar doesn't care. Even the UAE accepted an actual credentialed diplomat from the Taliban. So there are plenty of countries who are happy to move forward and deal with this, terrorist group that is a human rights violation just in itself. So I think it's important, and I've seen a lot of action lately from Western diplomats, the international community, where everybody speaks mostly English, has said, hey, we don't want to continue to have to meet with them. We would love to see an alternative. I think Afghans have caught on to that. They're hearing that message now and coming closer. There are a lot of groups of Afghans around the world that are trying to build something that can be a political alternative. And so that's a good thing because all the diplomats have said that we're not going to fund any militia groups or any kind of military group. So that's kind of a dead end right now. While I think if it was my country, I would be trying to fight the Taliban and throw them out of power. I don't think there's a lot of future in that effort until a political group comes up. So they've got to talk and fight at the same time as they have throughout the last 20 years. I think Afghans are getting their head around that. There's a path, but it's not a fast one.
Sure. And it sounds so you think it has to be both. It sounds like you're saying fighting is inevitable to get that power back, but just not in like a resistance type.
I think it will be hard to get the Taliban out without some kind of military force against them. That's just the nature of the beast. But I don't think it can succeed alone. Just like I don't think the political opposition could, a government council in exile could succeed if there wasn't some military pressure. So I think Afghans have got to be able to do both smartly, and that's a tough thing to navigate when people are so divided. And like you mentioned earlier, it's going to be tough when any Afghan sticks their head up and says, I have been nominated to lead a council of a government in exile. Even Afghans who hate the Taliban are going to attack them because, well, that's not my guy. That's not my girl. It's not who I would have picked. No one asked me, and it will be painful. But I think Afghans have got to push through that with some form of body. And that will take some of the pressure off the militia groups who feel like they're alone and have no support. Now there's somebody they could slide under, and that makes them more palatable. But as they stand today, I just know support is not going to come straight to any kind of militia organization, whether it's, it doesn't matter if it's the best in the world and they have all the best intentions. People are afraid of funding the next civil war and they don't want to do it.
Right. There's been so much violence, but I can't see. It's really hard to imagine the future of Afghanistan. And I think it gets easier sometimes, the atmosphere that I noticed when I started talking to Afghans in late 2021 was just fear and like what comes next. And now it's kind of toned down to, okay, I've learned how to live, especially for people still in Afghanistan. Like I know how to live kind of without a job and, without getting my head sliced off of my body. But yeah, it's that, what do I do next?
Yeah.
What comes next? When are these people going to be out of, there's just so much uncertainty. And the sense in the the population who's come and talked at conferences, what is their feeling right now? Are they feeling, do you think, more hopeful as between year 1 and year 2? Do you think, what's the general consensus there? What's the feeling?
I get the feeling, and I'm just reading tea leaves here, but I get the feeling that more Afghans are seeing the Taliban as a flawed organization that's basically running a criminal enterprise, doesn't care about the humanitarian conditions in the country, doesn't care about the health, doesn't care about the economics, as long as they're making enough money to help their people. And they're seeing just the same corruption problems that every government has when it starts out. So I think Afghans are probably hopeful that the Taliban are going to ruin themselves with the infighting and just tearing each other apart. And if money gets cut off, they're going to get into criminal activities that make Pakistan and Iran mad. So, they don't have a great future if they stay on the path they're on. And I think Afghans see that. And they are used to regimes coming and going. I mean, it's not like this would be the first time the Taliban have taken power, and they know how long that lasted. And maybe social media and the internet gives Afghans more of an advantage this time. They can communicate and coordinate and collaborate faster and better. So maybe that can speed up the process of the Taliban decline. But I think there's a glimmer of hope there. But unless some countries get behind the Afghans who want a better future, it's a really long road, because it's hard. As much as Afghans have very good reason not to trust any country right now, because almost every country in the world has betrayed them, I think they do realize that they're going to have some allies, whether they're long-term or short-term. Somebody's going to have to help them to get rid of this terrorist regime.
Sure. And I do think that is a hard thing when, I don't think I've heard of a country that Afghans feel is really friendly towards them. And the US obviously has done a lot to bring people here, but when you get here, it's still this adjustment process where not all Americans are friendly to Afghans. Sure. And it's just I feel that right now, friends of Afghanistan are in short supply, but in high demand. Like, they're needed. This is the time to, I would love to see Tom West meet with the folks who are part of GFA and listen. And I know that that's a process. You have to get to that government in exile. You have to get there. And I hope that that's the next concerted effort that we see, instead of this kind of constant sense of, that there's nothing, there's not the hope, there's not the building. Yeah. So it sounds like things are moving in that direction through the work that you guys are doing, that other organizations around the world are doing. And that's a fantastic thing. What's on the horizon? What's the next step?
For us at GFA, we're going to continue to work on that effort, try to help Afghans bridge some gaps and come together in consensus of things they do agree on. We've been running an Ideas Shura program where we get young Afghans, 29 years old and younger, to write short essays, 1 or 2 page essays on key questions. It's on our website, on key questions that will influence what the next government looks like one day. And so it's a way that we can get the youth to explain what they envision for their future. These are folks who had 20 years of good education and relative security, depending on where they lived. And so it's great that they can tell us in Pashto Dari or English on a short paper, and we've got a team of folks that evaluate them and look at them. So we're going to continue to get those ideas from them, put those ideas out on our website, kind of publish those ideas, maybe do some op-eds with those young folks, and continue to amplify Afghan voices and help them talk through all the tough things they've got to sort through to get to some kind of government in exile that can challenge the political and diplomatic authority of the Taliban. But the time is running out. The clock is ticking. The Taliban get more and more recognition every day. And so I think that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, what about our listeners? What can they do to make a difference for GFA, or just for, Afghans who are scattered around the world right now?
You don't have to be on the GFA team to do what we're doing. Listen to Afghans, help them write op-eds, get them in front of public audiences in your your town, if they're in diaspora here in America, get them an audience. Uh, Help them sit down with our legislators and tell them what they envision for the future, so that message gets through. And continue to help them, of course, resettle and integrate into American society if they're here. And then there are people around the world. There are some great groups out there that you can work with to get aid into Afghanistan, specific families you might know. So we work with ASEAL and HBT, two big nonprofits that do very direct assistance and are able to get around a lot of the issues that are over there in the country. And then the other piece is just helping people continue to evacuate. There are a lot of folks that are still trying to move through third countries to get to Western countries. So continue to be there to support them and do the paperwork that needs to be done, get them connected to the right people. I still have emails coming back and forth from the State Department and various U.S. government agencies about different people in that process. So just keep after that piece of the puzzle. And just, I think, really just listen to Afghans. If you're connected to them in social media, talk to them, help them think through stuff. I mean, everybody needs an ear right now. The trauma and the mental health crisis that's occurring in Afghanistan and amongst the refugees is huge. Beyond that, it's affecting all of the veterans and all of the other government workers who deployed into Afghanistan. So I think checking on each other, talking to each other, those are important pieces of the puzzle.
You just hit it all the things in 2 minutes. That was very impressive. I think, that's everything. The aid, the mental health, even here. I never really thought about this. We had recorded an episode with a lovely Afghan man who came here. He's a citizen now, and he has just this beautiful story of helping his parents escape by going back to Afghanistan. But when we were finished recording, someone else mentioned, he had gone through trauma, and he doesn't get to use the VA. And he had served with our forces for more than a decade, had been in the vicinity of multiple explosions, had been severely injured in one to the point that he was blinded for months. And it took him months to learn to walk again. But he doesn't get to come to the VA now that he's here. And he doesn't get care for what almost certainly, I'm sure he was concussed during that. And, TBI is definitely a possibility. And he's just here working his tail off. And he's just the kindest man, has given so much of himself, and so, to me, it's what can you do? And it's hard because there is so much need. But seriously, a SEAL app, you mentioned a SEAL. If you have $60 a month, you can feed a family. It's gone up a little bit now with, winter coming and food prices increasing, but you can feed a whole family. And that, that does not escape notice. That's a big thing to do. So everything you said, Jason, was brilliant and lovely. And I hope that our listeners will do something, share this with someone else. The impact you can make, it might seem small to you, but it's huge to someone else. We usually end our podcasts with a letter from an Afghan. We really think it's important, like you said, listen to Afghans. It's one thing for you and I to get up here and talk about our experiences, but I think it's so important for listeners to hear from Afghans about what they've gone through firsthand. And so I just want to remind all of our Afghan listeners, whether you're in the United States, in a third country, or still in Afghanistan, we want to hear from you about what your life was like under, 20 years of U.S. presence, during the withdrawal, afterwards under Taliban rule, anything about your lives that you think the world should hear. Please send it to us in a letter. We had one beautiful poem, anything. We don't care what form it comes in. Send it in to the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. And we are happy to include it in an episode, and we will give you anonymity if you need it. That's not a problem. Jason, I just want to thank you again for everything you've done for the country, for all the people you serve beside, for Afghans still through GFA. It's really incredible. And, to see someone's passion take on that embody all of these things that you've been able to do. It's really, really amazing. And I'm so grateful to have you here today.
Thanks for having me on. And I wish I could do more. I had a lot of Afghans over the years keep me safe and feed me and take care of me and give me good advice. And so I listened, and I'm trying to repay that.
I think you're doing a splendid job at that. And I think that will be so clear in, the time to come as all these things coalesce, really. Thank you to all of our listeners for sharing their time, as always, and for supporting the people of Afghanistan. Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you again soon.